My son called me 17 times before I picked up. Not because I didn't hear the phone. I heard it. I was sitting at the kitchen table watching my wife laugh at something on her laptop, and I remember thinking, someone is trying very hard to reach me right now. But I also remember thinking I didn't want to interrupt the quiet. We hadn't had a peaceful evening in weeks. When I finally answered, my son's voice was thin and strange. "Dad, I've been in an accident. I'm okay, but I can't drive. The car is blocking the road and I don't know where my wallet is, and I need someone to come." He was 28 years old and he sounded like he was 9 again. I stood up from the table. My wife looked over. She already knew something had happened just from the way I moved. I told her what he said, that he'd been rear-ended on Route 9, that his car wasn't drivable, that the police were there, and he needed a ride home. She tilted her head slightly the way she did when I gave her information she was deciding what to do with. Then she looked back at her screen. "I have dinner with Carol and the others in 40 minutes, she said. "You go." I paused. "My truck's at the shop," I said. "Can I take yours?" She closed the laptop gently, not in anger, just with a certain finality. "I'll need it to get there on time," she said. "Call him an Uber. He's fine." I stood there. "He's on the side of Route 9, Ellen. He doesn't know where his wallet is." She picked up her phone. "He's 28, she said without looking up. "He can figure it out." Figure it out. I heard those words, and I felt something I can only describe now as a door closing. Not slamming, just closing. Quietly, with that soft click of a latch settling into place, I called my neighbor Ray. He drove me out to where my son was standing in the dark with a police officer, a crumpled rear bumper, and a look on his face that he was trying very hard to keep composed. On the drive home, my son sat in the back seat and stared out the window. At one point he asked, "Where's Ellen?" "She had plans," I said. He didn't say anything else, but I felt the weight of what he didn't say the entire ride home. That was the night I started reading the statements. "I need you to understand something about the kind of man I am, or at least the kind of man I believed myself to be for most of my adult life. I'm 63. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the same firm in Columbus. I'm the kind of person who checks load-bearing calculations twice on a Tuesday because the math has to be right. I raised my son from the time he was 3 years old. His mother and I divorced when he was just a toddler, and I had primary custody from the start. I learned to do things on my own because there wasn't always someone beside me. Then I met Ellen. I was 38. She was 33. She was warm, competent, funny in a dry way that made me feel like she saw the world clearly. We married after 2 years. I had no illusions about romance. I wanted a partner, someone to build something real with. And for the first years, that's what it felt like. I added her to everything. Joint accounts, the mortgage, my 403(b) beneficiary designation. Not naively, deliberately. Because I believed in the institution of what we were building. I believed in us. She stopped working 6 years into the marriage. Her consulting work had tapered off, and she said the overhead wasn't worth it. I made a good salary. I told her not to worry about it. Looking back, that phrase carries more weight than I realized then. The years settled into routine. She managed the household. I managed the finances. Or so I believed. I handled the bills, the investments, the tax returns. She handled the social calendar, the house decisions, the family logistics. It was a division that worked, or seemed to. When I retired at 61, I rolled everything into accounts we both had access to, a joint brokerage, a joint savings. My pension deposited automatically. I trusted her with the access because that's what you do. After 23 years of marriage, you stop auditing your partner. You start living. That was my first mistake, not trusting her. Stopping paying attention. The night my son sat silent in Ray's back seat, something in me refused to settle. I waited until Ellen left for her dinner. Then I opened the laptop. I didn't know what I was looking for. I think I was looking for confirmation that I was wrong about the feeling I had. I wanted to find nothing and go to bed and chalk it up to a hard evening. Instead, I found the transfers. The first one was from 11 months earlier, $14,000 wired to an account I didn't recognize, labeled Consulting Advance. I sat forward. The next month, $9,000. Then $6,000 in a series of smaller withdrawals that would have been easy to scroll past. I pulled up the credit card statements. There were charges I didn't recognize across 3 different cards, 2 of which were issued under her name alone, but tied to our home equity line of credit, a line I vaguely remembered authorizing electronically about a year ago. Ellen had said it was to update our insurance-linked financial products. I had signed from my phone during a football game. I typed the business name from the wire transfers into the state business registry. A limited liability company registered 14 months ago, listed owner Ellen Margaret Holt. The address was a co-working space off High Street downtown. No revenue filings, no listed employees. I sat back. I'm an engineer. I build things to hold weight. And what I was looking at was the opposite. A structure designed to move weight out of one place and into another without anyone noticing. I heard her car in the driveway at 10:30. I closed the laptop and went to bed. I lay there in the dark and I didn't feel betrayed. Not yet. I felt something more like I feel when a beam calculation comes back wrong. Oh, there it is. Now I know what I'm actually dealing with. Ellen came in, moved quietly in the bathroom, got into bed. I kept my breathing even. She was asleep in 10 minutes. I was awake until 3. The next morning, I called Marcus. He'd been my financial advisor for 12 years, since before I retired. He was good, careful, the kind of man who thought about tax implications before he thought about anything else. I told him I needed to sit down and go through everything. Not an annual review, everything. He heard something in my voice. He said, "Can you come in today?" I was in his office by 9:30. I set a folder of printed statements on his desk. He read through them the way I would look at a structural report, calmly, then more closely, then very carefully. "When's the last time you reviewed the equity line?" he asked. "I thought I did about a year ago. I may have signed something I didn't fully read." He nodded without judgment. "That's how these things happen." He turned the screen toward me. The line was open for $120,000. Current draws, $63,000. I stared at the number. $63,000 drawn against your home equity in 14 months, he said. The transfers to the LLC account total $38,000 of that. The rest is distributed across personal accounts and expenditures. "The SUV she drives," I said slowly. She said it was paid off. He checked. Financed. Through a personal auto loan in her name only, secured 14 months ago. Monthly payment coming from the joint account. He paused. "David, she's been building a financial position separate from this marriage, systematically. That equity line was the foundation." I asked him what my options were. He told me the same things a financial advisor always says in these situations. Protect your income, establish individual accounts, freeze the equity line. But then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "Whatever happened to make you look at this?" That was probably the least of what she's been doing. The question is what she was planning to do with it. I drove home with that question sitting in the passenger seat. When I walked in, she was at the kitchen counter on her laptop, coffee beside her, the way she spent most mornings. She looked up. "How was Ray?" she asked. She sometimes called things by the wrong name when she wasn't paying full attention. "I went to see Marcus," I said. Something shifted in her expression just briefly. "Oh, why? Annual review," I said. She nodded and looked back at her screen. I stood in the doorway and watched her and tried to reconcile the person I was looking at with the numbers I'd spent the morning reading. I couldn't fully do it. I still can't. People are more than their decisions. But decisions are also who people are. That afternoon, while she went to her yoga class, I did 4 things. I opened an individual checking account at a different bank. I redirected my pension deposit effective the following month. I called the home equity line servicer and placed a fraud review freeze pending documentation, a process that takes 24 hours and requires no explanation beyond unauthorized exposure. And I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Wren. A friend from my engineering firm had used her 5 years earlier during his divorce. He'd said she was precise and unhurried and didn't let emotion drive procedure. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I told her the full story in her office the next morning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question before anything else. "What prompted you to look?" I told her about Route 9, about my son in the dark, about the words, "figure it out." She nodded slowly. "It's almost never about the money," she said. "But the money is almost always where the truth is hiding." She tapped her pen against her notepad. "Your equity exposure is serious. She's drawn $63,000 against a jointly held asset without documented discussion. That's not just financial irresponsibility. That's positioning." "For what?" I asked. "An exit she controlled," Patricia said. "On her terms, her timeline. She walked me through my options. Legal separation with asset protection orders. Temporary financial boundaries pending review. I could file quietly, protect what hadn't been moved yet, and enter mediation from a position of information rather than ignorance." I asked her the question that had been sitting with me since the night I read the statements. "Is she leaving me?" Patricia considered that for a moment. "I think she was preparing to have the option to leave," she said. "Whether she'd made the decision, that's a different question." I filed the next morning. Ellen was at her book club. The process server reached her at home 2 days later at 11 in the morning. I know the time because she texted me at 11:02. "What did you do?" Not a question. A statement. I was sitting in my car outside the hardware store when the message came in. I read it. I didn't answer. She called at 11:05. I let it ring. 11:12. 11:18. By noon, I had 9 missed calls. By 2:00, 17. The voicemail started controlled. "David, we need to talk about this. This is an overreaction. Call me back." By the 5th one, the control had thinned. "You can't just file papers without discussing this. You froze the equity line. Do you understand what that does?" By the 12th message, I heard something I hadn't expected from Ellen in 25 years of marriage. Fear. Not of me. Of the structure shifting beneath her. Of the exit she'd been quietly building becoming suddenly visible. I answered her call at 4:17. She was on her 17th attempt. "David," her voice was tight. "What exactly is happening?" "I reviewed the accounts," I said. Silence. "I found the equity draws," I said. "The LLC, the auto loan tied to our home. 38,000 transferred to a company registered in your name alone." More silence. "Then, that's my business. I'm building something. With our home equity," I said, "that you accessed without telling me. You would have said no." That sentence was perhaps the most honest thing she said through all of it. "You're right," I said quietly. "I would have wanted to discuss it. That's called a marriage." She exhaled sharply. "You're punishing me because I didn't drop my plans to pick up your son." "I'm protecting assets that were being moved without my knowledge," I said. "Those are 2 different things. So that's what this is. One evening and you blow up 25 years. "No," I said. "One evening and I started reading." The pause that followed felt different from the others. Less combative. More like something opening. "What do you want?" she asked finally. Her voice had gone quiet. "To understand what you were building," I said, "and why you couldn't tell me." She didn't answer that. Not then. She arrived home that evening and I was sitting in the den. She came in and stood near the doorway. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. "I talked to an attorney," she said. "I assumed you would. She says I have grounds to call this financial abuse. And I have documentation showing 63,000 in equity draws that weren't disclosed," I said evenly. "That's why I filed legally rather than just freezing accounts. Documentation is everyone's protection, including yours." She looked at me carefully. "You're not angry?" "No." "You should be angry." "Why?" Because that would mean this matters to you, she said. I looked at her across the room. 25 years. She still knew how to find the soft part of an argument. This matters to me, I said. That's exactly why I'm not yelling. She sat down. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I felt like I was disappearing, she said finally. You had your career for 30 years, your pension, your son. Everything was already in place when I met you, and I stepped into your life and it was already fully formed and there was no room for anything that was just mine. I let that land without answering immediately. I would have helped you build something, I said, if you'd asked. You would have supervised it, she said. There's a difference. That was probably fair. I'm an engineer. I do supervise structures. It's not always a gift. But Ellen, I said slowly, there's a difference between building independence and building an exit route on my money without telling me. She looked out the window. Maybe I wasn't sure which one I was building. That was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. And it happened because a filing landed on our doorstep. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday in early April. Patricia and Ellen's attorney, a composed woman named Dana Reeves, sat across from each other while a mediator named Robert worked through the itemized list. Home equity, retirement accounts, the LLC, the SUV financing. Ellen sat across from me and she looked like herself, which was almost harder than if she looked different. Same posture, same steady expression. We had shared this table with contractors and insurance adjusters and our son's teachers, and now we were sharing it to untangle what we'd built together. When Robert reviewed the equity line draws, he addressed her directly. These funds were accessed using jointly held collateral. Do you have documentation of discussions regarding their use? We have joint finances, she said. I shouldn't need to file a report for every decision. $63,000 isn't a decision, Patricia said calmly. It's a pattern. Dana put a hand on the table lightly. Mrs. Holt's position is that the LLC represents a legitimate entrepreneurial effort using marital resources in a way consistent with her role as a financial partner in the household. Her role for the past 19 years has been as a beneficiary of the household, Patricia replied, equally calmly, not a financial contributor. The equity line was signed under the representation that it was for insurance paperwork. Ellen's jaw tightened. She looked at me. You told her that? It's what you told me, I said. I said it was financial paperwork. The equity line is a financial instrument. I signed from my phone, I said. You know exactly what I thought I was signing. She looked away. Robert moved us through the structure. The retirement accounts, my 403B, my pension, my Social Security, were protected under individual designation and untouched. The home was jointly held, appraised at market value, subject to buyout options. The equity line was to remain frozen pending formal resolution. The LLC and its liabilities were assigned entirely to her. The SUV loan entirely her responsibility going forward. By 3 in the afternoon, the preliminary framework was outlined. No courtroom, no gavel, just signatures on pages that divided a quarter century into columns. When we walked out into the parking lot, the air was cold and the trees were still bare. Ellen stopped beside her car and looked at the sky for a moment. I never wanted it to end like this, she said. I know. I wasn't leaving you, she said, not definitively. I was giving myself a door. I know that too, I said, but you built it with wood from my house. Without asking, she nodded slowly. She didn't argue the metaphor. Your son, she said, how is he? He's fine. The car's a write-off, but he's fine, she nodded. I should have gone with you, she said quietly. That was wrong. It was the closest she came to apologizing. I decided it was enough. She moved into an apartment in Westerville in June. I helped carry boxes to the elevator on her first day because she had a bad shoulder and the building had no dolly available. She seemed surprised that I showed up. You didn't have to do this, she said. I know, I said. You said that before. She almost smiled. Almost. The drive home was quiet. My son met me at the house with a pizza, and we ate at the kitchen table and watched the game and talked about nothing important. At some point he said, "Are you doing okay, Dad?" "Yeah," I said. "I think so." "You seem okay," he said, studying me, like actually okay. Not pretending. "I stopped pretending a while ago," I said. He nodded like he understood more than I'd told him. Maybe he did. He'd watched more of my marriage from the outside than I'd ever fully accounted for. The legal separation was formalized in August. My pension deposits into my individual account every month. The mortgage is paid down on an accelerated schedule. The equity line is permanently closed. My retirement projections, modest and mine. I review the statements now. Every month, line by line, the way I used to review load calculations. Not out of paranoia, out of clarity. There's a difference. Ellen's consulting business has found some footing. I know because my son mentioned she's been working with a few small retail clients. I felt nothing complicated about that. I hope it works out for her. I mean that. We speak once in a while, cordially, briefly. Last month she called to tell me that a mutual friend had retired and asked if I'd heard. We talked for about 8 minutes. When I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment and tried to identify what I felt. Not grief, not bitterness, something more like completion. The way a structure feels when the last beam is set and the weight is finally properly distributed. My son stopped by last Sunday. We took his dog on a walk around the reservoir. At one point he said, unprompted, "I'm glad you handled all of it the way you did." Not dramatic, just handled. I thought about that for a while as we walked. She was building something, I said. I couldn't be angry at her for warning that. I could only protect what was mine while she figured out whether what she was building was away from me or just away from depending on me. He was quiet for a few steps. "Is there a difference?" "Probably," I said. "But at a certain point, it stops mattering." That evening, I sat on the back porch with coffee. The sun went down slowly, the way it does in August in Ohio, drawing out the light longer than you expect. I thought about Route 9, about my son in the dark, 17 unanswered calls, and a woman inside my house deciding that his emergency wasn't her concern. I used to think that was the wound, the cold indifference of figure it out. But sitting here now, I understand it differently. She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. She was telling me, without knowing she was telling me, that the structure of what we were had already shifted long before that night. She had already partially left. She just hadn't told me, or maybe hadn't fully told herself. What she handed me that night wasn't rejection. It was information. And I spent the next several months doing what I've always done with accurate information. Building something that could actually hold. If you've ever found yourself providing stability for someone who would quietly stop providing it in return, you know the particular exhaustion of that, not the dramatic exhaustion of a fight. The slow erosion of carrying more than your share, while everyone, including you, pretends the weight is evenly distributed. I'm not bitter about the years. Most of them were real. But the last few years of a marriage can recontextualize the ones before it, and I've had to do some honest accounting about what I missed, what I ignored, what I chose not to see, because seeing it felt like too much work. That's the part I'm still working on. Not forgiving her. I've done that. Forgiving myself for being the kind of man who checked load-bearing calculations twice, but didn't look at his own financial statements for 8 months. Numbers don't lie, they just wait. If something in this resonated with you, if you've ever been handed a door and had to decide whether to walk through it, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I read all of them. We share stories like this here because sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing someone else found their footing too. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. I'll be here.